Well, good to see everyone. Thank you. Welcome back to the new semester. I can't think of a better way to start it off than with our second installment of Preservation Futures. For those who don't know me, I'm Frank Matero. I'm the Gonick Family Professor and Chair of Historic Preservation. Happy to welcome you back. And for those who are here for the first time, welcome. So for those of you who were here at the last panel event, we spoke about preservation and society. And this is part of a four-part series that the department is holding this year, entitled Preservation Futures, which is dedicated to understanding how the preservation field has changed and is changing in light of urgent calls for social and environmental justice and better science. Today's panel will be addressing historic preservation and history. I'll just say a few words and then I'll turn it over to our faculty leaders on this. So the panel will consider preservation's engagement with public history and with humanities more generally. They'll consider how the field has deployed history to identify and address which buildings and landscapes matter, what publics and what narratives to serve, and how effective are existing tools of documentation and intervention. At a moment when history itself has come under increased public scrutiny and debate, our panelists will consider opportunities for historic preservation to lead the way in showing how and why the natural and built environment matter. So to lead us today, it's my pleasure to introduce our three faculty who'll be working with our other panelists, Francesca Ammon, who's Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning and Historic Preservation, Sarah Lopez, Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning and Historic Preservation, and Aaron Wunsch, who's Associate Professor of Landscape and Historic Preservation. So thank you, faculty, and thank you to our guests who are here today. It's always wonderful to see new faces, and I'm glad you're here. So with that, who's taking the first?
Welcome. I'm really excited to see you guys here. I'm Sarah Lopez. I joined the faculty just last year. So history as a discipline has a very secure and well-defined role in the field of historic preservation. And the typical story goes something like this. There are certain structures, relics worthy of saving. As the built environment transforms, it loses legibility for some who feel attached to a particular aspect or element under threat. The field of historic preservation does important work, identifying and then often bounding particular places, deeming them as worthy of maintaining for future generations. In this formulation, history is operationalized, and history-minded preservationists make tough decisions, not only about what to fight for, but about how to fight for it. So sometimes whole buildings are designated as officially historic. Other places might be marked by an informative plaque. The designating and bounding nature of the work of historic preservation is critical, but it's also garnered criticism. We might think of, for example, how historic preservation has been a tool to preserve plantations, but only in the last decade or so, more recently, also the cabins and landscapes of enslaved peoples. Debates about preserving capital A architecture as opposed to everyday architecture ensue. Some 30 years ago, before this current turn, Dolores Hayden stated in The Power of Place, she started it with a vignette about this precise fallacy, arguing that the histories of all people, including dispossessed, racialized, marginalized, and otherwise, elevate, characterize, and define the buildings and landscapes of our cities. She also argued that there is a power in the power of place, that we actually have to fight for the material representation of all people's histories in urban spaces.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Francesca, and I want to just build on some of these comments too, a little bit more, setting the stage for our conversation. Sarah articulated it beautifully, kind of where we're starting from, thinking about history's place in the field. And I think it's important to add that, history is not just a compendium of facts. We know this, right? It's not just an encyclopedia. It's analytical. It's interpretive. And it's about lifting up both the iconic and also those things that were previously invisible and less appreciated, both of which were integral to city making and both of which are important to public memory too. So it's a balancing of both of those things. And that all sounds great, right? We want to recognize all these histories, but there are tensions. And one of them, of course, is the tensions with development and reuses of space and can't save everything. And how do we prioritize? How do we think about these things? And as Sarah's mentioning, who is fighting to preserve these alternative histories that are embedded in place? Who's fighting to expand the historical narratives? And with demolition, has been a constant throughout time, right? And these battles between the development and wealth and the value of land, how does that compete with history? How can we make these stories, particularly of peoples and events that have been hidden, compete with that? So these are questions, right? This is why we can't just agree that we love history. We're interested in it, and what does it mean on the ground? And so the image that we're showing here is just an example. This is not a roundtable about this site. It's just one example that I think really embodies some of these questions. This is a site here in Philadelphia on Northern Columbus Boulevard, just near Spring Garden, for people who know the geography. It's a former cold storage facility. It was designated. The developers of the property who wish to convert it to housing didn't fight that designation. They're looking to reuse it, and reusing it will change the building. It will require, as they propose, potentially punching some holes in the building, building something above it, maybe losing what's become a really recognizable mural that was put on the building in following September 11th. So there's layers of history, right? This site has meaning for multiple moments of time, multiple peoples. And so where do these things come to a head too? How do we recognize the histories, but also engage with the realities of capitalistic development? So we hope we can talk about all of these things today, how preservation and development can coexist, and what role history has to play in helping us figure out how to intervene there. So with that as kind of preamble, we'd like to introduce our guests also. And introduce them, in fact, through questions that invite them into this conversation. So, Sarah, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, so we have Jared Farmer from the Department of History here at Penn, which we're delighted. You can look up his bio on the website. He's done excellent work. Elihu Rubin, also from the Yale School of Architecture, is joining us today, and our own Aaron Wunsch, who many of you know or should know from historic preservation here. So Jared, I was going to start with you. Jared wrote my new favorite environmental history book, period. And Run, Don't Walk, okay, Elder Flora. And so in some ways we could say, what do trees and what does the history of trees have to do with preservation? But if you'll indulge me very briefly for a moment, I wanted to just read 3 definitions that he proposes, 3 insights he had from the work he's done, and see if we can apply them to the built environment. One definition and one word is place time. No hyphen, no break, place time. A tree's lived experience of time in place and place in time. The synchronicity of multiple temporalities at the speeds of geology, evolution, and history in one rooted locus. Timefulness emplaced, which I just think is, you don't get a better sentence than that. The second one, chronodiversity. Again, one word. The condition of temporal richness in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So think biodiversity and then say chronodiversity, right? That temporal richness. And the last one, temporal service, an indirect benefit of age-old things, particularly elder flora, to human life, such as the encouragement to meditate or engage in long-term thinking. And I like that last definition because service, the idea of service, is often thought about in capitalist terms, right, as sort of like an economic benefit. And here it's thought about in a different way. So Jared, what does the axis of time do for us when we think about built landscapes? And if you could just reflect a bit on how your research on trees or other aspects of your research inform your thinking about preservation.
Okay, thank you for that very generous blurb. Yeah, there's a whole section in my book that's focused on the 19th century, kind of the century when Europeans are inventing kind of this preservationism as we think of it today, like, listing buildings. But there were other Europeans in the same moment who were thinking about listing plants or habitats as monuments of nature. At the same time, you have like, urban planners and architects thinking about listing edifices, that kind of thing. So that's kind of where this kind of began. I suppose I'm a landscape historian. As long as you think of landscape, also including the non-human. So I'm an environmental historian, but I actually prefer to think of myself as a landscape historian who just focuses on the non-human elements of all the landscapes in which we live. I guess if you think of preservationism in the context of buildings, right, there's the exterior, right, and then there's the interior, and then there's the surroundings. And I think there tends to be an emphasis more on the exterior. The people are often very concerned about like the use inside, but you also have to think about like the life outside the building, right? Because you can save a building but lose the neighborhood in a sense, right? Because the life of the street is no longer the same, and it becomes, a museum piece essentially, right? But surroundings also includes like the non-human, which introduces, I think, interesting legal but also kind of philosophical questions because it's harder to restore, let's say, a tree than a building, or it's a different set of problems, right? And also, I think a lot of people just don't think about that or see that the non-human in the kind of surroundings of a building, and like I really want to kind of focus on that. I'll just say one other thing and then I'll hand it off. Like the issue of trees in historic preservation isn't that old, maybe only because like urban street trees are not that old as like a planned thing. They're modern, right? And in fact, many of the kind of beautiful tree-lined boulevards that are now listed and worthy of preservation and are preserved um, were the result of like cities tearing down their fortifications, right? Their city walls, or blasting through these diagonal viewscapes, like in Paris, right? The kind of things that would make preservationists kind of wince now, right? But then they did produce these beautiful trees. So I think that just suggests that everything is complicated, right? And people have different views about trees, often very culturally specific. And in general, more trees are better, I would say. But trees also die, and trees are supposed to die. And I think they're dying in landscape is part of what makes them monuments and makes them, I think, different than buildings because you can see them growing and dying. I mean, you can see that with buildings too, but you can't maintain a tree exactly the same way as a building. So it is a kind of chronodiversity to kind of appreciate like a tree in a building and conversation and surroundings. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jared. I want to introduce Elihu Rubin as well. I did not bring his book. I should have. Elihu wrote a wonderful book called Ensuring the City, which thinks about the way that urban renewal and corporate culture and investment intersected in the post-war period. He's working now on many projects, one of which is about ghost cities. And Elihu teaches in 3 areas at Yale, right? Primarily based in the School of Architecture, but also significantly involved in teaching and leadership in American Studies and also the Urban Studies program. But notably, there is no preservation program or department at Yale. And there's that said, you work in the area of preservation and public memory. And I wondered if you could reflect for us a little bit on how your experiences both teaching at Yale in this environment where preservation isn't as cemented of a thing as it is here, doesn't have the history that it has here, living in New Haven, how those experiences have shaped your approach to history and preservation.
Thanks, Fran and Sarah. It's really an honor to participate in this. It's great to come to Penn in Philadelphia. I was saying to our host earlier, Penn is the place to be for preservation and planning, and it's just awesome to participate in this. I also love coming to this building, just stepping inside for a minute into the library. And I'm so blown away by Frank Furness. I find him to be so fascinating. I thought, like, he built a huge Roman aqueduct and then he let it crush the columns. And he built the aqueduct. It's like, oh no, it's coming. And then finally the column just holds. There's this little stout little column holding up this massive aqueduct that fell on top of it. And I just love this place, and it's really great to be here. I got into the area through documentary film, and I started making documentary films with my very dear friend Elena Oxman about urban change and about public space. The first project was about Broadway in New Haven. Similar tensions as you have here between Penn and Philadelphia, where Yale was buying up all of the properties in this, what had been a very heterogeneous commercial district, a lot of ownership, very town gown kind of place, not an exclusively Yale place. But Yale decides they want to control this retail district. They start buying up the properties and attempting to manage it like an outdoor mall. They even hire one of James Rouse's top deputies, Bruce Alexander, to become a vice president at Yale to help oversee this process. And our documentary was about coping with change, understanding that vital districts have to change. It's very difficult to freeze the city in one moment in time. It's very difficult to preserve local businesses, which we might love because they're so central to a sense of place. But it's easy for us to say, if you're in a family business going on 3 generations and you're fighting with your cousins and there's stuff going on, it's very difficult to keep these things going. And we saw it in the built environment, where these very impressive and interesting signs, these old neon signs that were so central, again, to the sense of place, were coming down. So it was the sign itself impacting the built environment and being unable to preserve them in situ, at least. But the signs stood in for this symbol for multifarious, heterogeneous, small-scale proprietorship that was going. So you had the built environment and the composition of the people making up this business district that was changing. And we tried to give both sides of the story. It is a kind of lament on the past. Why? Because we form attachments to the places that we first encountered when we came to this place. But it would be unfair to say that the new students coming into Yale and New Haven aren't forming new attachments to the new stores that might be coming in, even if they're chain stores. I mean, I used to tell a joke that, when I was a student, we used to go to the Yankee Doodle, which was this great greasy spoon, and it's gone. I tell them, at Yale, there's 2 generations. There's Doodle and post-Doodle. And you are post-Doodle. And I'm very sorry to say that. But there was for a long time an Ammon Penn. And who am I to say that the students won't form their own powerful attachments to Ammon Penn? And when Ammon Penn leaves the scene, which it also did, those students will lament the passing of this other place. So a little bit of it is modesty about the importance of places to different people and how we think about preservation. Now, some of those signs found their ways to this epic museum in New Haven called Lost in New Haven, a huge warehouse. I sit on the board of this nonprofit now, been taking my students there forever. And it's like the neon graveyard kind of thing in Las Vegas, with many, many artifacts from New Haven's history that are preserved, not in situ, but in this particular place. And it allows those memories to just burst back into the minds of all the people sort of participating in it. And I introduce my students at the School of Architecture to places like that and to stories like that. A lot of students coming to Yale School of Architecture come to work with me because they want to be engaged in New Haven. They want to be engaged in local politics. They want to think about some of the issues around preservation, critical heritage, the politics of memory in these places. And so we started doing projects around industrial heritage, thinking about brownfield sites, environmental justice, industrial history, and producing works to invite a public or multiple publics to engage with that material. and to try to put forward an argument for it being important. And we've done also, in our own kind of modest way, something else I'd love to continue to talk about, but ephemeral landmarking as guerrilla public art, really. You know, that we have this thing in memory and preservation, all these plaques everywhere. Why do we have all of these plaques with one piece of information for all time on some building? So why don't we have ephemeral plaques? Let them come, let them go, let them stay up for 6 months, a year, 3 years, and put up a different plaque with some other story about the plural nature of these places and how important it is. I got really invested in that idea, and saying, forget about these plaques. It certainly gratifies the plaque maker. You know, most plaques are more about the plaque maker than what they're plaquing. And in this ghost town book that I'm working on, there's a group of Western plaquers. I'll wrap this in a minute, sorry, but called E. Clampus Vetus. They were the Hysterical Historical Society of the West. You're from Utah, so you know them. They're in all the mining places. And their plaques are hilarious because they pull out just the most little picaresque little random detail. And it definitely feeds the kind of Wild West memory of these places. Contrary to a different, more critical take that Patricia Limerick or others might say about mining places as degradation, exploitation, dispossession, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that you could cover those plaques and create something new to draw out more stories became really, really appealing to me. Yeah, last point then, right now. We get involved, myself and my students, in actual preservation battles or fights to repurpose buildings and experimenting with different forms of media. And so I brought today some examples of this because we started working on the Gough Street Armory, which is owned by the city and has been completely disused and allowed to be neglected. So we decided that there was no preservation movement behind this thing, and myself and I became a community gardener at the Armory Community Garden. It became a literally grassroots movement around the building. And then we started publishing newspapers. We published the Armory newsprint as a way of informing people about the building. Our research helped put it on the National Register. And then we started having public meetings. And the idea was just put out the newspaper to everybody. It's very difficult to know exactly how many people said. I can't say I was deluged with emails from people who saw the newspaper, but we put it on every single doorstep, and then we in the neighborhood and beyond, and we published another one just to let them kind of circulate. And this is itself ephemera. It is ephemeral. It will come and it will go. And so thinking about those kinds of experiments to me is I'm very invested in that kind of work. And I do want people to take these when I leave, because as I became a newspaper publisher, newspaper publishers are always looking for distribution. So, you know, you have to hopefully people will take a look.
You've been a historian in this program, now department, longer than any of us on this panel and in the room. If you could talk about some of the experiences that that have shaped your engagement with history and preservation.
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity to do that and for convening this. I join the others in being glad to have this opportunity. And I guess I would say, you know, my academic training from undergraduate through 2 layers of graduate school has been in history. But for even longer, I've had a foot in the preservation world. My son is now 15, and I'm somewhat painfully aware that by his age, I was working for my local historical commission. Needless to say, he has not gone this path and is much more interested in forging metal and climbing. Go for it. But to the extent that there is sort of such thing as a preservation insider, I guess I'm somewhat that. And you're right that a big chunk of that in the last really 20 years has been teaching in the field. So before we get into the sort of nuts and bolts of that, I want to suggest that preservation is dogged by dichotomies that don't serve us well. By us, I guess I mean people in the preservation world, but I would also say the public at large. Um, and those dichotomies run the range from academic history to public history, um, people versus buildings, which is one of the ones that almost always gets trotted out, usually as a way of showing that the person doing it is on the right side of that issue, whatever that may be. And I want to suggest that these pairs, these dichotomies, are really not helpful, that they actually get in the way of talking about what we really want to talk about. They also don't do justice to the nuances of their respective sides. The context in which I'd like to discuss that is the work I've done for the last 15 years with various African American congregations, church congregations in Philadelphia. I was counting up the numbers of these, and I think they now stand at 7, distributed really throughout the city, with the exception of the Northeast, where I really haven't done work, but in South Philly, in West Philly, and in Northwest Philly. My question for our conveners is, should I burrow into that, or do you want us talking to each other uh, first? How much detail do you want us to do in our individual dives? Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like many other um, large American cities, particularly in the Northeast, Philadelphia, in the wake of the Great Migration, saw a lot of outmigration by white urban congregations and saw their buildings taken up by African American congregations, often congregations that had started out closer to the core of the city and end up buying up these buildings starting in the 1940s and 50s. Um, not just because they're fairly inexpensive to purchase, but because these buildings are often really impressive and make for a kind of I guess you could say, a great symbol of how far a congregation has come, that they can afford this grander, bigger space. Um, and in many cases, that those congregations that buy up these buildings in the 40s and 50s are still there. They have now been there longer, in most cases, than the white congregations that built these structures. And their claim to them as stewards is in many ways stronger, I would say, than those original congregations. Um, there's a broader preservation story here, which is that long before preservationists coined the term adaptive reuse, these congregations were practicing it. And it makes them in many ways a part of a larger story of preservation that African Americans have contributed to. This is one piece of a big story, but I do think that the African American role in preservation is the sort of the big story. You could say the iceberg beneath the ocean that pops up at various points, and really, to this day, needs a lot more exploration than it's gotten. Um, what I have enjoyed about working with these congregations is that the work, while it begins in classes that I have taught, invariably means that I end up working with the congregations after the classes are over, usually starting with materials that students have generated, but then talking to the congregations themselves about what they need. And I think I can say sort of bluntly that they don't want to be told their own history very much. They don't want to be told the history of their congregation. What they do want is a usable past. They want the kind of history that can be used to complete local or national register nominations. They want the grants that often come with that kind of recognition. And in a way, speaking of modesty, they enforce a kind of modesty on people with academic training because they say effectively, we know that's your training, but we want this practical thing, maybe that benefits from your training, but really can serve us well. We're well aware that our buildings are important. They're also really hard to heat and really expensive to maintain. What can you do to help us? And that's where things get interesting. So I'll stop there for now, but plenty more detail if you want it.
Thank you. Should we go straight to the questions?
Yeah. Yeah, and just for our panelists, feel free to interrupt in general. You don't have to wait to be, yeah. Yeah, so you just mentioned the dichotomy and potentially not being useful in terms of thinking about buildings versus people. I was thinking about how Jared Farmer mentioned the different kind of spatial realms, the inside versus the skin versus the surroundings of a building, and how those have three different, in some ways, social histories, although they're overlapping and related. And also Elihu Rubin was talking about the speed with which businesses change and how attachments, to a certain business at one point for a group of people look different at a different time with a different group of people coming in. And I guess it's a to what extent question, just to expand on this idea a little bit more, to what extent is there a social history on the one hand that is motored by people and communities and institutions, and a material history on the other? To what extent are those two distinct realms? What happens when we think of them as distinct histories? What happens when we don't? And anybody who wants to respond.
Well, that's an interesting question. The physical history, architectural history, or just the architectural descriptions of the building and the social histories. We found in doing work on the Armory and engaging different publics in different settings that there are a number of major social events that were shared by many people in their kind of collective memory of this building. But there were almost an infinite number of individual stories that were important to different people about what they observed or who they met, or meeting their future partner at the inaugural ball of the mayor, for example. And that we realized that soliciting these stories, inviting these stories, was going to become central to building a constituency to care about the future of this building. And to also build a sense of empowerment amongst people who very often feel like, yeah, what is happening with the Armory? Why isn't anything happening with the Armory? And now they feel, hopefully, kind of personally kind of implicated in this. And then there's the architectural history, which has a kind of link to that. Armories in particular, as you well know, have two distinct parts at least, but you have the drill hall, this large open span area, which is very special to armories, and some kind of head house, buildings, rooms and corridors for meetings, administration, and this kind of thing. And, both the military history of the building, its use by the National Guard over time, is reflected in this. And that's also part of the social history. A lot of people remember the building from serving in the National Guard. But it was also from the beginning built as a civic space with lobby areas and always intended to be able to be used in that way. So they were connected. The architectural history of the building or the affordances of the architecture were connected from the start, from this kind of dual intention to serve the military purposes and the social purposes or the civic purposes. But just to bring it home, Sarah, to your point, we found that a lot of people who had experienced the building had never really looked at it. And they had never noticed some of these, what we thought were very subtle but powerful architectural details, even just the kind of protruding piers or the very subtle arch corbelling, for example, that gave it its kind of sense of place. And it was an invitation just to look at the building and to begin to see it again, and to try to make that connection between the social history of remembering events inside the drill hall to actually kind of appreciating this physical artifact and understanding that some of the military purposes, for example, were central to why it is, why it became what it became.
Yeah, building that. Yeah, because sense of place, of course, requires people, right? You can preserve all these buildings, but there's not the people to like feel, right? Because sense of place is a feeling, and that was about. I have to hold it closer. Okay, sense of place, right? Is a feeling, and I'm thinking about like who needs to be there to feel the feeling, and I'm thinking about Philadelphia. I'm relatively new here. I showed up a couple years before Sarah, and it's a fascinating city to think about. And just to simplify, there seems to be like two Philadelphias, right? There's the part that tourists go to, and a part of that is a World Heritage Site, and lots of things are protected and listed. And a lot of buildings were torn down so you could see those buildings that are now listed and protected, right? And then there's the rest of the city, which to me is the more authentic lived, well, it's where Philly people live now, and it's the row house city. It's 19th century workers' homes, two-story red brick, and that goes on and on and on, right? And these buildings are not listed, and they're not historic in the individual sense. No individual row house is like worthy, I guess you would say, according to like the 19th century kind of standard of like listing, is worthy of being on the register. But if you think about how distinctive Philadelphia is for having so many linear miles of intact row houses, it's incredible. And that is worthy of protection. And so like, how do you think about the lived experience of like multi-generational Philly people in those row houses as preservationism and encourage them to think of themselves as a kind of preservationist as they just do weatherization and home repair and renovation so that you avoid this kind of unuseful dichotomy of like preservationists being, people like us, right? College educated, wealthy, whiter, people who are interested in like edifices, and then like, the people who like actually make Philly Philly, whose homes are often in need of repair. And like, how do you, avoid the kind of death by a thousand cuts? Because every time a developer tears down like a row house that is fixable by itself, I mean, it's not a tragedy, but if you think ahead of 50 years of this, like that is an incredible preservation tragedy. And you could lose, the social life of the city with the distinctive kind of architecture. So I know like Aaron's thought a lot about this, but I just kind of want to kind of throw that out there.
Still works. So the social versus material histories that you have put before us, I think, correspond roughly to the sort of people versus buildings dichotomy that I laid out, and I would submit that they're actually inextricable, which doesn't negate the usefulness of these pairings as sort of starting points or heuristic tools. Um, and I think of Dolores Hayden's book, Power of Place, as a kind of model for how this is done. She opens the book by talking about this debate between the sociologist Herbert Gans and the architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable. And, Gans stands for people and Huxtable stands for buildings. And in the course of her introduction, they face off and they seem irreconcilable. And the book I then expected would underscore how different these worlds are. In fact, the book does quite the opposite. As you read through it, you see that the social and the material are thoroughly intermixed, and that Dolores Hayden and her students were part of the effort to do that. In many ways, at the forefront of that effort. There's a reason that after The Power of Place came out, the National Trust started saying this place matters. Place sort of assumed a new saliency as a way of bridging the social and the material, and I think it still does that. So obviously more to say on that if we want it. But I think the same lesson has really come to me again through this work with church congregations, where it's true that I may come into these situations knowing, say, who the architect of the building was or what style it is. Um, those things, marginally relevant to the congregations, relevant in as much as they can be used to secure grants or nominations. Um, it's not where they live, though. What they do get is that not only are these buildings attractive and well built, they for a long time have served the purpose of bringing new people on board, people who come to the building because they're curious about it and end up really liking the service that they attend or the pastor that they meet. There's a preservation story to be told in buildings that recruited people to become members of congregations. So again, all of this is to say, when the dichotomy gets sort of picked away at a bit, I do think it falls apart, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't start with it, but it does mean you shouldn't end with it.
Just a quick thing, and then thank you. I was just thinking, as also Jared was talking about the row houses, about how, just to illustrate the way I think about what you guys are talking about, the row house as a material form, as he was describing, stands. And then the question for preservationists may be, does this building, does this edifice, does this artifact qualify, right, for keeping for future generations for some reason? But the other way we could think about the row house, and just to bring history into it, the history of the row house, in addition to the kind of formal qualities of it, is what does it mean to share a party wall? What does it mean to not have two sides to a house, only a front and back? What does it mean to have your front door literally the same 3 steps up as the 18 other front doors along the entire block, right? So if you start to think about the social history of the material form, it kind of expands the way you argue for the importance of that building, right? Because then you really, for example, in the one I'm just thinking of right now, can't say we should save one example of a row house. Then you're saying, no, actually, there's a reason to save the block.
Yeah, I think obviously, as we've talked about in our classes, district nomination to offer opportunities to think about whole communities and how individual stories add up into a place that has meaning and history, and that people there can be a groundswell of local interest in designating and protecting too. And so building on what we've been talking about, how do we get publics engaged in this history? I completely agree, Aaron, that forcing divides between academic history, public history, this is not where we need to focus our efforts. That said, the more that preservation can engage with the public and think about public history as what we're elevating, not just arcane, architectural stories, but meaning that connect to social life. I think it's still important to unpack what we mean by this with public history and really who are the publics that you all in your work have thought about engaging the challenges of that. Again, I think it sounds good. In reality, what have you learned about who these publics are, how to reach them, and the opportunities that are still unmet in really bringing preservation and history to the broader public?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question. Just to thinking about Francesca, what you and Sarah have just said, it feels to me like it becomes the question of does it qualify it becomes less and less important. And even writing the district nominations, for example, become less important in some sense. If you were to map the national registered districts in New Haven, it would very closely align with affluence and what you might call gentrification in some parts of the city, because those groups had the kind of consciousness and wherewithal to decide they were going to do this partly to get access to some of the some of the historic tax credit incentives to do that. Whereas the building stock in poorer areas of the city is very similar. But that group hasn't taken the time to do it, or was perhaps less aware of it, the kind of organizational, institutional sort of issues here. And thinking about how we can help people do maintenance and do care, do preservation without it being preservation, I think is really, really important as a kind of advocacy. So thinking about preservation advocacy, just as we've thought about planning advocacy, becomes very, very important, but not in this way that's putting the building or even the streetscape first, but putting, Aaron, just as you said, the needs of the people living there to make things easier, to make the repairs that are necessary. In New Haven and in many other cities, you might very well be dealing with mega landlords that own huge swaths of the built environment and working directly with them in some of the same areas. Because if not, you do have a tough sell sometimes on preservation. I find in many conversations saying, yeah, I mean, preserving that would be nice, but why would we spend any public money to stabilize this building when our schools are failing? How can you possibly make that kind of allocational decision there? And beginning to build the arguments that preservation is a social justice issue, preservation is an environmental justice issue, or that there are real benefits that can accrue in thinking critically about proposing policies that will make it easier for people to maintain their own homes and to care for them over time. But yeah, I mean, again, I'm curious what others think about this in terms of, I mean, we know more than ever that engaging multiple publics is absolutely central, acknowledging that multiple publics have different relationships with the buildings. And I think we've been experimenting with events, and happenings, and the importance of food, for example, to bring people out. The importance of childcare at the events that we have has become increasingly important, to make it easier and easier for people to come together just to begin to have the conversations around how to care for privately owned residential buildings or larger institutional buildings that are disused.
I don't know, like workshops or kind of DIY kind of spaces where people, if they want to like redo some of the bricks or redo the roof, and they can learn the know-how, form friendships. I have a very specific question though about maintenance of churches that I want to like throw to Aaron, because like I just don't know the answer and I'm really curious. So because Philly I know has a problem of churches. This is not just Philly problem. This is all over the world. I mean, Europe has solved this problem in a very different way. But when you have churches that have lost their congregations, but the buildings haven't fallen down yet and they have architectural value, then how do you save them at time, essentially? And so in Philly, there have been so many churches, by the time people get around to listing them, they are so decrepit that it's just too expensive to fix them. Like there's just not enough money in the world, or not enough money in this city. But I think about my neighborhood where I live now in Graduate Hospital. On Fitzwater Street, within like 3 blocks, there's like a historic Black Baptist church, beautiful, that was purchased by the attorney who ran for district attorney. I forget his name, the Republican. Anyway, he bought it and turned it to like a beautiful like penthouse apartment, which is like an interesting choice. But the exterior looks spectacular. But then a few blocks down, there's the Union Baptist Church built in the early 20th century where Marian Anderson as a teenager sang, and it's right around the corner from the Marian Anderson house. And as far as I know, the congregation is very small now and hasn't met in the building since COVID times. And I don't know if they're ever coming back. I walk past it every day and it's clear the building is, it's holding up all right, but you can imagine 10, 20 years from now. But of course, there's no way in the world that building will ever be torn down, right? Because like Marian Anderson sang there as a teenager. There's a state of Pennsylvania plaque in front of it saying so, right? But if you wait 50 years to do any repairs, it's going to be so expensive. So like, is there any kind of mechanism? Are there any like philanthropies or that focus on that kind of stabilization or just kind of the enough maintenance so that when you get to it eventually, it won't be so expensive?
So a couple of thoughts on that topic off the bat. One is that I should probably mention the work of Partners for Sacred Places, which aspires to answer these questions. I think one can debate their effectiveness, but they certainly, I think of it in they think of their work in the terms you just laid out. The reusability of a church, either by a different congregation or for a totally non-religious use, often hinges on where it is relative to the center of the city. So, there's obviously a premium on space the closer you get to the core, and that often has a way of encouraging more creative forms of adaptive reuse. Whereas stuff further out often sits neglected and no one does invest in it, and then it gets torn down. I will say this is one of the cases where looking outside of the US is a useful lesson. In the UK, they call this problem redundant churches. And when I was there over the summer, I saw churches that served as climbing walls, churches that served as Airbnbs. And that's, initially, I think, offensive to people who think of churches as sort of inherently religious structures. But when they come to the point that you describe, the congregation is gone, the building is in rough shape, I think various things compel us to be as creative and flexible as possible. And also looking again to what other countries have done. They're sort of less squeamish about this question than we are. Um, to get back for a second to the term preservation, rather than getting rid of it, I'd like it to incorporate the definitions that we're talking about now. We spend too much time apologizing for it and trying to sort of work around it euphemistically. I think it can be made big enough to take in concepts of repair, of maintenance, as well as the sort of, thinking of other keywords that have come up today, humility, modesty, flexibility. All of these things maybe were not characteristic of preservation as it emerged in the 60s and 70s, but I think they're getting there. Um, Implicit in the last comments you made, Fran, was this question of which stories we tell, which I think is really front and center. And post Dolores Hayden, there is, I think, a growing pressure to tell more stories and broader stories, and that's absolutely as it should be. But one of the lessons of the class that you and I co-teach, documentation, is the less welcome words from your grumpy uncle at Thanksgiving. Well, you can't save everything. Okay, fair enough. Here's where historians' job and preservationists' job actually looks kind of similar, because both are in the position of selecting what is going to get said or preserved. They're both storytellers, and they have to choose their facts or buildings selectively. The mere charge to tell a big story falls flat because we can never tell every story all at once. Um, do social history and social justice provide us new beacons for the kinds of things we want to talk about? I think they really do. But that obligation to be selective in what you choose falls both on historians and preservationists. And I think there's no escaping it. It just, if nothing else, makes you more self-conscious about the selection process and what voids you're hoping to fill when you proceed with this work.
How do you bound things? Where do you draw the line in terms of deciding what not to save? It seems to me like that boundary is so essential to the work that preservationists do, right? Who are already struggling to get recognition and support for the specific places that are bounded. I'm thinking also about, for example, the issue going on right now in Chinatown with the 76 arena, and the role that preservation and specifically historians could play in telling a social history or a history of that place. But how do you think then in terms of like, do there need to be edges?
There need to be edges to the extent that you want to focus your case. But I think the scale of preservation is dynamic enough that you can move from the individual building on up to the neighborhood level without too much damage being done to the sort of intellectual integrity of the project. Chinatown, I think, very much needs to be framed as a preservation struggle, especially for those of us who have lived in cities like Washington, D.C. and watched what happened when things like the MCI Center moved to D.C.'s Chinatown. Even if you find yourself more interested in trying to preserve buildings than keeping people in place, you'll see that both are wiped away by something like the MCI Center. So I think it really is a pressing issue, and I do think that you can, at least up to the level of neighborhood, still apply preservation tools in some ways, the way Dolores Hayden did to bring focus to that particular cause. Can you do it to an entire city? That gets into a much more dangerous terrain. And I do think being selective is incumbent on us, but maybe the scale allows us to get up to the neighborhood level before things really start to get hazy. And this, of course, corresponds in part to the way nominations work, which is running from the individual building or site up to the level of the historic district. It's only when you start dealing with ICMOS and the UN Charter that you start talking about much broader scales of world heritage. And that I would say has its own real Achilles heel built into it, but we can talk about that separately.
I'm trying to figure out why I'm having like a mild allergic reaction to the idea of selection in this way. I think partly because now I understand that if you were to build a campaign around a particular building under threat, or ideally actually an anticipatory campaign before it's under threat, which I don't think we do nearly enough of. We find ourselves in New Haven often on the back pedaling here. The decision has already largely been made. The 90-day demo order's already been put out. And now we're like, oh, nuts, we should have, it's almost too late. And you find yourself in a position sometimes of making arguments for buildings that not everyone agrees could or should be preserved. Not everyone agrees has merit. We find this especially with like late deco, streamline, stripped classical buildings that people aren't like quite into. It's not as lovely and appealing as Art Deco. It's not modern. It's not the Lever House modernism. It's just kind of in the middle there. And we have lost buildings like that recently in New Haven, but we're backpedaling. We're not anticipatory. So the point of selecting, like if we're going to say, if we have a certain amount of time and a certain amount of effort, we might need to select a particular building or place in an anticipatory way, and that is selecting our own efforts. But the idea that selections are being made based on parameters of merit, I think I'm for some reason I'm uncomfortable with that. I think it would be just as helpful to really think about the broader issues around affordability or access to services and figure out, what needs to be done in these areas, as opposed to saying that these row houses or these two-family Edwardian houses from, the turn of the last century should be saved because they're significant. I feel like if you're not the people living there and making your own self-selecting where you live, then it's not really someone else's job to select it for you, I think. In the same way that we know, Aaron, that the listings, depending on the type of listing, it can be very ineffectual. Most listings, from what I understand, don't really protect the building. They might create some incentives. In New Haven, we have these local districts. Now, the local districts are very powerful, and you can't change a spindle on your front porch without going in front of the Historic District Commission in these very small selected places that were, again, essentially self-selected. And I think they open themselves up to a lot of criticism of resisting different forms of physical and social change in those places. Yeah, so selecting in terms of anticipatory campaigns, selecting what urban policies to advocate for. I'm now advocating with the building department in New Haven that we need a mothball fund as opposed to a demo fund. If we spent the money that we spend on demos now, we wouldn't have to demo as many buildings. But the building department, which seems oxymoronic, perhaps, the building department loves putting out demo orders. It's their favorite thing to do. The bricks start falling off, demo order. And you can understand reducing risk and liability. But if we could invest now in a kind of active public stewardship building, let's just say for publicly owned buildings, or buildings that come into public ownership because of foreclosure or something else like that. If we could, and there's no user, and there's no user right now. If we can convince them, spend the money up front, and it will be worth it down the line. And then we can have the debate whether or not we want to spend the money on one kind of social service. And can we say that mothballing these old factories is actually a social service ultimately, that this building can be incorporated productively into the public realm? I would like preservationists to be making those arguments, and at the scale of public policy for sure. So the selection there is to select what policies to advocate for, perhaps.
Could I riff a little bit on selection as the designated tree guy here? So I'm going to make an analogy just as a thought experiment with the Endangered Species Act. Just celebrated its 50th anniversary. 50 years ago, remember, science-based ecological preservationism was a bipartisan issue in this country. You know, Richard Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act. It's hard to believe. I'm 50 years old, so I can't believe what has happened to my country in my lifetime. But if you think about the Endangered Species Act, I mean, the basic model legally is that you identify like single species of concern. You know, they're vulnerable, they're threatened, they're often charismatic, right? And you try to save them at all costs, right? Heroic efforts to like save this species. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes, yeah, you save a species, but it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of intervention, but you might, in a sense, lose its ecosystem in the process, because ecosystems change and they're under threat, especially with climate change, et cetera. So there is an alternative model, which is like, don't focus so much on any individual species, but focus on the functionality of the ecosystem, knowing that like it will change. Some species will win out and some will lose out. Some will go extinct, but some new ones will evolve in the long run, but also you'll get species coming in as the environment changes. And as long as you are preserving variability and functionality, like that's the key thing. So like the analogy would be a city. It's like, yeah, you can like focus on this building. We must save this building at all costs, right? But again, you might lose the neighborhood or lose the sense of place of the city in the process. Or you could think about what is the social fabric as well as the architectural fabric that makes this place, and how do we create policies that encourage people to build new buildings that, you know, continue that history, as well as, you know, protecting old ones. But in a sense, we want developers to build new buildings, right? We need more housing, but we want those new buildings to fit into a lived social history that honors the past. And like focusing again, like on the ecosystem of the city might be, again, it's not an either or. I would say this is another unuseful dichotomy, right? I would say that we need to do both, and we should, you know, save endangered species too. But like, don't forget the larger ecosystem, which is changing.
It's a great analogy. I think that would be really helpful to think about it that way. And I think that we put ourselves, I mean, I for many years was on the board of the New Haven Preservation Trust, and this was constantly happening to us. Buildings were being threatened. We would jump into action, write letters, and and then the building would come down, and I felt it hurt our credibility by choosing this and then it failing, so people could say, "Oh, the Preservation Trust, they can't do anything. They're not they just keep, you know, they have no input, they have no sway. What they say doesn't matter. It's just a kind of objection." And that's what got me thinking. I think just don't select the singular endangered species, not even a species, just the singular endangered one animal, one specific animal to save. Now, at the same time, you know, Aaron and Sarah and Francesca, I mean, there may be specific buildings that we really have decided this is too good to lose. And if that's the case, we have to make that list, as we sometimes do, endangered buildings list right now, and start talking to the owners and talking about economic resilience ideas going forward to allow it to happen. And then sometimes giving up some of the integrity issues, the physical integrity issues, which gets us so tripped up sometimes as well. Let go of some of the physical integrity, keep most of it, do a kind of multi pronged outreach campaign to get lots of people invested in remembering the building in different ways. Because when we pick a battle and make the selection and we lose, it stings and it hurts our credibility, I feel.
But I feel like there's a silver lining, or there's something worth risking, going out on the limb and trying to save, because it helps people to see places in a different light and start to understand their history and appreciate their history. The worst case, they lose the building still, but there can perhaps be other ways of commemorating and remembering that history.
Yes.
The better case is that marshaling of energy actually helps to fuel the fight too, right? And so if we go back to the case of Chinatown and the 76ers place, there's a campaign going on right now to support the arena, and we're confronted by it all the time. On my way here, I saw the big billboards on the buildings on Market Street as heading to the subway. They're just scrolling how wonderful 76ers place, whatever it's called, will be. My son watches sports highlights, and the promo is for that, how wonderful this is going to be. How does history compete with that, right? What are the mechanisms, what are the modes for disseminating knowledge, generating knowledge, and turning that into useful activism too? Because this is a big campaign too. And I like that you brought the newspapers, Elihu, to think about, okay, this is the media that we're using, but what are the modes of assuming that there are these opportunities to ignite an appreciation for history? What's the mode for furthering that, disseminating it, making it lasting, and having it stand up and have power?
I promise not to go on too long. I'm going to defend selectivity maybe more as a sort of practical necessity than a matter of high ideals. But that's a conversation that in many ways may be better framed as what stories do we tell? Both historians and preservationists are choosing to create stories that then confer importance on facts or things. And I think that question of which stories we tell comes directly back to the question of who gets to tell them. And one of the benefits of the book, The Power of Place, is that, at least in theory, the people who get to decide are the communities that are being interviewed for oral history and for other purposes. The questions kind of emerge naturally out of that process, and the priorities emerge somewhat naturally out of that process. We're used to thinking of preservation being done by, to use the term, deciders at the state and federal level. That's one official version of it, but there are plenty of other possible versions of it. And I would say that there is a more democratic version of selection that maybe is more appealing to you than the conventional one. So I'll leave it at that.
Just to chime in really quickly, I'm having a bit of a, sort of, in answer, Francesca, to what you just asked and what Jared was talking about with the Endangered Species Act. It seems to me that the discipline of history itself, as separate from the field of preservation, because there's obviously lots of overlap, but we're also talking about distinct realms as well. And some people who are historians are involved in preservation on a daily basis since they're 15 years old. and others are not. Um, but it seems to me that the role of historians to write histories of places as ecosystems could actually be one of the ways that history writing and researching itself supports the work that preservationists are doing in not just in the selection process, but just in fighting for pieces of the ecosystem, right? It's like meaning making has to happen in order for there to be arguments that materials matter. And I think history writing as an independent discipline is where a lot of the meaning making happens, right? So maybe it's partly just about us thinking, us as in potentially historians, thinking about our role in relationship to the service of that ecosystem argument.
And I do think that nominations by design, individual building nominations, they're bounded by design, right? You have your legal boundaries, and it really encourages a looking in and a focus, which is useful in terms of the legal power of designation. But this kind of systems approach, a more urbanistic approach, which is how people relate to buildings actually too. I think it helps us think about the usability of the past, to draw on what Aaron said, but also engaging people in ways that matter to them too. So I think there's something there to thinking in a more systems urbanistic kind of way. And it's entirely consistent with the field. It's just thinking about scale maybe in a different way. And the legal structures of nominations, fight against that or encourage us to move against that, even though it's maybe not what's best.
I think in ecosystemic history, and I think environmental historians have been really smart about this, is a great kind of proposal or agenda. And I think that allowing the multiple stories to exist at the same time, for example, in the case of the Gough Street Armory, it was recently put on the Connecticut Freedom Trail for two reasons. One of the reasons it was put on the Connecticut Freedom Trail is because during the 1970s, it hosted the Black Expo, which was this very influential, led by the Black Coalition of Greater New Haven. It was sort of a Black Wall Street event in a way about entrepreneurship. That was one reason. And the other reason was May Day 1970, when the National Guard mustered at the Gough Street Armory to descend on the New Haven Green to put down a huge political protest, protesting the trial of Black Panthers at the courthouse there, which seemed like a negative association in some sense with the building itself, but drawing it both out together. It was the two of them together that kind of placed it on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. And we found that the stories just came pouring out after that, that so many people had memories of being on the green that day with their parents, for example. And so many people had remembered being at the Black Expo and being inspired by it. And the idea that these events were now being kind of formalized by history, was very meaningful to people. And it made a lot of people sort of value even more, in some sense, or recognize that their own experiences were part of history, that they were living history themselves. And it was inspiring to see that happen.
So I'm thinking a little bit about like the role of monuments and the role of like monuments in remembering buildings that cannot be saved or were lost long ago. So like the 76ers play in a whole vast area that's all former wetland, right? The whole sports complex, which includes a casino. I mean, that's just such a fossil fuel landscape. And like Sonia Duboman, wrote so well about landscapes like this. But there is no monument to all of like the destroyed wetlands of South Philly. And I would like there to be. But if you think about the two biggest areas of redevelopment in the city right now, there's the Navy Yard, which is full of beautiful historic buildings that are being reused, kind of an amazing site. And then you have the refinery complex, which is just being razed to the ground to create the Bellwether district. But there is there are legal reasons for this because like, the refinery was dirty and hazardous. And I don't know that you can, I don't know if they even thought about it, but I would love there to be a way to kind of maybe save some of the infrastructure to create some sort of like work of monumental art that kind of reminds people that this was like the original oil refinery in North America and the longest running oil refinery in US history. And it's almost all gone now. And I'm, on one level, I'm grateful, but then it's also kind of disturbing that you can just erase that much history in a few months and there might not be any kind of built reminder of all the thousands of people who work there and live near it and suffered because of it. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of like, that's a whole other set of issues.
That's a great design brief for the students in this room.
I want to add the word yes. As we look for new targets for storytelling and for preservation, industrial history is one of the great neglected areas of that work, especially in a place like Philadelphia, which is or was an industrial city par excellence, and a pioneering one, as you suggest as well. It doesn't mean that we give up on the environmental stories. Well, I mean, the sort of I guess you could say chemical residue of these uses is so deeply infused in the land that you can't not talk about it or address it through remediation or commemoration. But yeah, industrial stories and places and buildings really do have, I'd say, a neglected role in the work that we do. So here's to more of that.
Another interesting piece of the story of the sites that you've been mentioning, Navy Yard, Bellwether District. If you read the Inquirer, Inga Saffron wrote about this in her latest column, and the editorial board today or yesterday, the Inquirer talked about the transportation ramifications of those things. So not only are those sites, there's preservation at the Navy Yard, but not at the Bellwether District, and just the loss. That's not the end of the story. There's going to be a growth of transportation infrastructure to support these things, which will fuel the demolition and clearance of neighborhoods, right? So again, we come back to this kind of systems networked idea of how all these things are connected and the multiple histories that are affected by each decision, commemorating, reflecting on what was lost, absolutely, and then thinking about, once we kind of let certain histories go, what other ones can then get affected too by the systemic infrastructure that supports these decisions too. Again, thinking outside the boundaries of one building and what's being saved or lost and what the ramifications are. They're really big. And this saga is another one alongside the 76ers in this city that should be attracting a lot of attention from a variety of design fields and neighborhood residents and historians.
Amber, there you go. All right, then. Dr. Wiley.
And we're going to pass the mic so the people on the Zoom can hear.
Thank you. Oh, wow. This isn't a question as much as it's a comment, because a number of things that you all said really resonated with me, and I can see everybody. Is that as I was on the trolley on the way over here, I was thinking to myself, I'm going to start telling people I am a social historian of the built environment. You know how we as educators, academic scholars think about how we're going to brand ourselves and the work that we do. And so the conversation that you all had around like social history and thinking about even the ways that certain Black congregations value their space in terms that aren't necessarily architectural, I'll just say that I've seen these conversations in research I've done around the bicentennial, specifically when there was a, I guess, push to nominate more Black National Historic Landmarks, and Black social historians they were the folks to give the meat to the stories about the places. And there were studies that said this social architectural history dichotomy is really hurting Black historic places. And so, I mean, Aaron, maybe this is a question. Like, Aaron, I don't know if how do we rectify, and maybe not just Aaron, but like, how do we rectify this notion of the dichotomy? But I really feel like we're gonna have to update my biography on the website. Amber is a social historian of the built environment. Because the story, like, I love design and buildings as much as the next person, but it really is the stories that help, I don't know, like, get us grounded in place. So I don't know where to go with that. Just a comment.
I don't have a particularly profound answer, but it seems to me that the answer that comes to mind is practice and process. Yes, stories confer meaning on places and facts, but the process of getting there is all important. Is it an individual official making these decisions? Is it a community? How do you define community when the term itself is so nebulous and there are obvious rifts along class, race, and gender lines in communities? I'm sure there are other rifts too, but those are sort of the historian's checklist, right? For better or worse. So I think, again, to be a good social historian of the built environment, you need to be really attentive to how your stories get generated. And you know this better than I do, but I think that's the key, practice and process.
Hi. As someone who also thinks of myself as that sort of historian, I think it is really hard to make the argument that people and things are one thing. Social history and material history is one thing, and it has to be made. And it's hard to make it. And it's hard to then marshal the evidence to sort of describe exactly what you mean. If you have the social history of a congregation that you're talking about, and a legacy of intergenerational knowledge, and the history is written about from the perspective solely of what the people have spoken and said and done, and the building isn't seen as an interlocutor in every single step of that genealogy, it is a false history, in my opinion, because you don't have the same social history if it didn't have, you just don't, if it didn't have a specific material caravan to carry it and shape it and continue it and broadcast it to the street. And so it's not easy to make that argument. So this is one of the reasons I got excited about having Jared Farmer, who is in the Department of History, as opposed to the four of us who have all been dealing with kind of spatial and material issues, in schools of architecture, because a lot of historians tell histories that are completely aspatial. And I read them and I think they're fabulous. And then I think, but what could they have done and said if they had paid a little bit of attention to the environment or to the artifacts that are actors in their stories that get no voice? And we're kind of the opposite. We give a lot of voice to the artifacts, but what could we do if we pay more attention to that other aspect, right? Which is why his work as an environmental historian is so awesome, because it kind of melds those two evidence bases.
Yeah, I mean, Amber, I think that's a great way of describing it. I don't see any contradiction there. The reason why I study architecture is because I'm interested in society. I mean, that architecture is this incredibly powerful source of evidence, but also container and reproducer of social, economic, political ideas and norms over time. Now, if you were interested in doing a history of design and you wanted to talk about Frank Furness and his, I mean, that's another kind of social history, but more about the building itself, for example, or about buildings, which is also totally legitimate. A different set of kind of actors there. But I think, social history of the built environment, absolutely, that's what makes the built environment so vital and so important. I mean, this is why I think every student in the college, university I teach at should be studying architecture. Just as you say, sir, how could you do anything without architecture? It doesn't make any sense to me at all. Obviously, anyone interested in economics and politics and social history and anything, how can you not be engaged in our surroundings in that way? So it may be incumbent on us to make that point even more clearly, as you suggest, Amber.
Can I just add, I want to pick up on the built environment part of what you said, Amber. I think we can talk about architecture, but the built environment is a concept that's more expansive that helps us to unite these things. And it's no coincidence that that's how Dolores Hayden identified herself as a historian of the built environment. I think it encapsulates the social, the cultural, the political, the economic, all those other things. And to the extent that the public can understand preservation as being about the built environment and not just architecture, I think that's really useful for this field being something that matters and connects and operates in a way that is meaningful to the daily lives of people who don't initially understand that they care about architecture, but or may or may not. And I don't want to say people don't, but I'm just saying that if that's not something that's going to bring you in on its own, but it's going to be part of it. And it's just language matters. And I think these terms are part of how we understand our histories, and then the sources we go to and the connected stories that we tell while we think about architecture in a much more connected way that the built environment helps us do.
Say that the built environment includes organic things, right? Non-human things that humans may put in place but don't have full control over. And then I always say that the surroundings of the built environment that includes guarding things is the unbuilt environment that is also part of, I think, the realm of study. So I don't know. To me, it's just like history is the story of people in place in time in the fullest capacity. So like do what you do. That sounds great. It's like, yeah.
One sort of meta lesson of this conversation is that keywords matter, that paradigms matter, I think. And I really like the ecosystem model for thinking about preservation. But going back to something else that you were saying, Jared, I think it's really important to think of preservation as repair also. That can be physical repair, it can be social repair. I'm not the first person to have this idea, but I think that analogy is crucial to moving forward in the field. So thanks for helping sort of tee it up.
Hi, thank you all for a great talk. I think one of the things that I've really taken away from this is if we consider an ecosystemic history, the aspirations and actions of historians and preservationists we see a lot of successes. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about the role of historians and preservationists in instances where that ecosystem maybe breaks down and you lose the physical structure or you lose the social ties and community, but one persists. So what is a community without its home? What is the building without the sort of social network that belonged to it? And then what is our role after the fact?
quick thought. To me, that question immediately makes me think, because on the one hand, it's like, it's not a problem that the community changes. Communities are always changing. When I read Jared's book, I was like, holy cow. I mean, these 5 million trees are having total millennial conversations and relationships with themselves in terms of migrating upstream and down. I mean, there's this sort of changeful aspect, but it brings in the question of equity and justice. And I think that's the key here, is that that's really hard for us to figure out. It's like the change itself in terms of the social change isn't a problem. But the problem is that how do we sensitively understand stasis in the built fabric in relationship to equity and justice in the social fabric? And that's just like such a difficult thing to answer in practice, that your question for me elicits.
I'll just say something very personal as someone who moved to Philly 4 years ago, not knowing anything about it and realizing that this city is full of multi-generational residents. It's really striking coming from New York City. Something like 60-70% of Philadelphians were born in the county, right? But then there's people like me who move in who want to understand Philadelphia. It's kind of a weird city, right? And I'm so grateful that there is Inga Saffron, for example. I'm grateful that the Inquirer was not acquired by a hedge fund, right? That we actually have a pretty decent local newspaper, and we have blogs like Hidden Philadelphia. I mean, I think for people like me, like who don't have multi-generational families that kind of tell me knowledge about the neighborhood, having these media outlets is so important. And this is a plug for, you know, or maybe a cry for local media in America right now, right? Because most cities actually don't have a newspaper like the Inquirer or a blog like Hidden City of Philadelphia, period. Much bigger cities than ours. So.
I think also your question, Rachel, makes me think about urban renewal when buildings were wiped away, and yet communities for generations sometimes still come back and have gatherings and reunions on the site. So it was never just about the buildings, although they would have liked to have stayed in their homes for sure. But it's about place, and it's about a larger scale, a site where a community can convene and remember. And to your point about some remembrance of what had been in the site, even though something did come, like we need to recognize that too, that all is not lost. There's still something about site and place that matter even when the buildings go. So it's not so simple as one or the other, but what opportunities do we have to still maintain connections of one or the other if one goes?
Thanks. This has been really terrific, and it hits the mark on the origins of why we are doing these panels. So for those of you who don't know, these 4 panel conversations came because faculty could not agree as to whether or not we should rename the program when it became a department. So my question is to bring history and preservation back together and ask, or at least reflect on in the course of the discussion, there were some inferred remarks that contemporary preservation practice is not up to the challenges of contemporary concerns, and that much of the laws and the regulations that we labor under were in 1966, quite honestly. It had not been revisited. So my question to you is, as historians, how would you improve the practice of preservation? It's easy to say it's faulty and it doesn't work because we're laboring under old policies created by old ideas. You clearly, if you represent the historians today who are considering the built environment and what happens to it, you clearly are thinking differently than those who did in 1966. Not all, but many. So what's the charge? You got to tell these people something. They're going to come out with a very expensive degree in preservation to practice. What words of wisdom do you have for them in terms of the authority of history in the practice or pursuit of preservation?
There's no greater authority than the authority of history in the practice of preservation. Thank you for that. I mean, seriously, like as Aaron said in an informal conversation last week, history is why preservationists do what they do, period. Full stop. I agree with Aaron. But I was going to say, one policy change, 50 years? Do we need that? Yeah, but that's one that would be an interesting, right? And I mean, there's lots of fruitful debate that I've heard amongst preservationists about exactly that question, right? Like, how do they think about significance? How is significance being defined, right? How does the definition get expanded? There was a national park Zoom on this Tuesday about the cultural landscape approach in preservation today. What's the state of it? How do we exactly this question? How do we use history to make the boundaries broader, right? More ample.
To use the stadium example, though, developers offer progress. What does preservation offer of the neighborhood? I mean, I'm baiting you. But it's the public sees the development as progress. When you say, but history matters, but what do you offer?
No, but so, oh my gosh, this is so great because I get to read Jared's definition again, that I started with, which is temporal service, an indirect. What does it mean? An indirect benefit of old age things.
I don't think we would say that. I think you'd have to say something like historians help the neighborhood understand its soul. Or, I mean, some language like that, because it's you will, or the essence, or I mean, I would gravitate in a political setting, not in an academic setting, more towards those kind of words. And I believe that actually, right? That yeah.
And historians will help us look at what's happened in the past, the battles that have been won and lost, and what have been I mean, as people have been readily talking about the other places that have had stadiums come in and what's happened to their Chinatowns. But the biggest thing that the historians can do is look back at the history to see how people have maybe worked around the margins and developed their own modes. I really like the idea we're talking about of repair and, maintenance, more modest moves towards preservation. People have been doing that all along. People are doing that. I'm studying Society Hill, people who managed to stay in the neighborhood and not be displaced and did more modest forms of renovation, rehabilitation, not the gold standard that was really expensive that someone new would come in. So people have been doing this. So I'd say mine the history to learn what we've been doing.
To get back to like unuseful dichotomies, I would say like, yeah, again, we want developers, we want their progress, we want their buildings, but we want them to also preserve the soul of the city in the process, right? And it's not a zero sum, right? Yeah.
I would just say, I think I have a little bit of a different perspective here. I don't think that history is why preservationists do what they do. I don't think preservation is about history. I think preservation is about the future. I think preservation is about sustainability. I think that what I would tell graduates of this program, the process is as important as the outcome in many cases. As social historians, we have an incredible opportunity and obligation to recognize diverse histories, and especially histories that have not been told. That to me is an opportunity. That is an important role that we play. But the case has to be put out there that preservation is one of the most vital fields in the future of urbanism, in the future of the way cities are going to be put together, not only in being able to value and remember diverse experiences in the city over time, but thinking about how cities are going to be ecologically, environmentally sustainable and resilient, and what kind of policies do we need now to preserve the buildings of the past and the buildings of the present going forward. I don't think there's any reason why preservation shouldn't be one of the, like architectural design, like urban planning, and working in teams as a group is part of the future of the city. And part of it is putting together inventive, democratic, inclusive, processes in playful, fun ways that invite everyone to think about it. And so, yes, history is important, but maybe not in the sense that we might ordinarily think of it as some like kind of fact or even set of facts.
Well, now that I know that Elihu and I disagree, we get to have a riotous debate over lunch. We do actually have to, I know there's more questions, but we do have to, want to just quickly, because we do have to stop soon.
Okay, just very quick question. Thank you for the excellent discussion. So I'm a student from Master of Architecture, so I've learned a lot from your discussion. And my question is, when we as designers do the project, especially in urban environments, so when we have to renovate some old buildings, designers may think those old historical marks or even political slogans on the facade, such as those things, we see them as beauty, but maybe some other residents, they think it's very brutal or even painful. So how do you think of these conflicts? How can we to deal with it? Or who can determine which to be renovated, which to be demolished, and who can determine the value of it? Okay, thank you.
I don't know that there's an answer there,
I
but
think that is an awesome question, and is incredibly vital. We find this frequently, not only in mottos or words, but also who the buildings are named for and the very painful associations, the kind of visceral violence that even names can actually enact. And we debate it very vigorously. Whether or not the name should be removed or whether or not the names should remain, so that we remember that there was a time in which people thought that this building could be named for someone like that. We face this at Yale quite a lot. I'm sure you have this here as well. And let the name remain and let it be vigorously contextualized or recontextualized in some very meaningful way. And I think this is a very active and exciting debate actually to be having.
I think it comes down to process, right? It's not about coming in and imposing. It's having those conversations need to be had.
Yes.
And it's in that process that whatever outcome is, everyone having their voice and whatever outcome is right there. I think the point about process is there isn't an answer, but there's an inclusive process. And with that, I think we do need to conclude. Thank you so much to our panelists and thank you, audience.